Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 6th of September. Today we're doing a frontline update. We're going to be discussing the situation around Zaporozhye on multiple different parts of the front line, looking at Kamyanske, looking at Verbove, looking at the area just to the east of the Velika-Novosilka axis, which I haven't talked about much, but is now being brought up in reports from both sides. Let's begin with the western side of Zaporozhye and make our way to Donetsk in the east. So beginning with Kamyanske, in this area, I have not really made any sort of territorial gains for either side. I haven't adjusted the map in a very, very long time. The fighting around here has really been static and positional in nature, and the lines for the Russians and Ukrainians respectively have really been determined by a river that runs through the center of the village of Kamyanske. You could see it over here. This is the river that was pretty much the dividing line for many, many months in this village. But now that river has pretty much dried up. You could see that it's very, very narrow and is pretty easy to cross. So it's not a major obstacle for the Ukrainian forces. And there is new geolocated footage, which I have linked on my map, which I will show, of Russian forces shelling Ukrainian troops in Kamyanske. And what's important is that this geolocation is south of the river, which was thought to be the dividing line between the two forces, which means that the Ukrainians at some point, it might have been recent, maybe it happened a couple of months or weeks ago, but either way, it does indicate that the Ukrainians have been able to make some minor advances in this direction and that they have control over this area over here that I'm marking with the square and also some of the residential areas over here. But on my map, I had these areas like over here within this rectangle under Ukrainian control for a while. This is something that has been known for about a month or maybe even more, that Ukraine was able to attack from their positions around Stepove and around, the greater Zaporozhye axis more generally, and attack towards the direction to the southwest and enter the southwestern corners or southeastern corners, of Kamyanske. So in all, we could say they advanced about, 900, 1,000 meters at most in this direction based on the new video, which I will show you guys now. Here is the video. It's located over here. And obviously, all of these videos are linked in the description because they're not my videos. And you can see over here the Russian shelling. You can see that there's a lot of trees that still have foliage on them, which could be used for concealment. And I honestly thought that a lot of the foliage was already destroyed, that a lot of these trees weren't fully grown, that they were damaged by the shelling. But despite all of the warfare that's been going on over here, there's still a lot of shrubs, a lot of bushes that are used by both sides for concealment. And a lot of the houses in these areas that were at ground zero of the fighting for so long, they're still standing and could be used for cover. But nonetheless, the Russians are still attacking those positions. And as you can see, here's the elevation map. This comes from a tweet that I wrote a couple of months ago talking about the significance of Pyatikatki. Since then, we haven't really seen much from the sector, but here you can see an elevation map, and you could see that Kamyanske is located over here. It is on pretty low elevation, but the Russians do control a hill to the south of Kamyanske, which gives them some favorable positions to view all of the battles that are going on within that village, while the Ukrainians, a bit to the east of Kamyanske, also have a hill of their own, which they use to overlook the valleys in Kamyanske and in Pyatikatki as well. Now, moving on to the situation around Robotyne. In this area, the Ukrainians have been able to advance from their positions in the southern outskirts of Robotyne to the trenches that Russia occupied in the area that is just to the north of Novoprokopivka. This is very interesting because if you listen to my earlier videos, I talked about how the Russians, they had these positions on hills, and the hills are located over here in these red rectangles, and they include many different trench complexes that are actually connected to a wider trench network, which includes underground tunnels that help connect all of the trenches together and move supplies across the front line. And that trench complex is also located in the area to the east of Robotyne. The Russians were utilizing this trench complex for a while during their fighting to help them continue the defense of Robotyne. And now the Ukrainians have control over this northernmost square, but the southernmost squares are still contested. Part of them are under Ukrainian control due to the fact that the Ukrainians sent in small infantry groups to try to infiltrate these trenches and clear them out. And there's now a lot of footage that we have to back this up. A lot of this footage is on my map and comes from my last video. But now there's another video that's been released, and a lot of these videos are being released by the Beaver drone unit specifically, which is a unit, it's a Russian unit that uses FPV drones, and they basically document everything. They document a lot of videos of how Ukrainian troops are trying to advance through forested areas, hedgerows, and then those FPV drones that they use target those Ukrainian forces. So just as an example, the one that's new that I just added to the map is of a Beaver FPV drone hitting a Ukrainian dugout south of Robotyne, geolocated to this hedgerow over here. So you can see the course the Ukrainians had to take to reach that point. They had to go from Robotyne along this road and then go through this hedgerow to reach the Russian trenches the Russians set up for defense, but now the Ukrainians are taking up positions, and they also took up positions in the forested area a bit to the west over here where you have those 3 arrows located. So here is the video for you guys. You can see there's 2 Ukrainian infantrymen that are able to enter this dugout, which was created by the Russians. And Beaver, they document how they were able to destroy the dugouts. I don't know what happened to those Ukrainian infantrymen, but it is undeniable that the Beaver drone unit has been effective in certain cases at preventing Ukrainians from sort of exacerbating and basically adding on to their previous successes, due to the fact that these drone units are able to stop those Ukrainian forces in their tracks, force them to withdraw. They're able to spot their locations, which helps out with reconnaissance more generally and with artillery strikes. So just I'll show the video over here. This is the consequence of the strike. Let's move on. So here, take a look at the front line just to the south of Robotyne. Look at these light green lines, which indicate the defensive fortifications that I have marked within this rectangle. And now look at this image that was made by this guy over here. I have the tweet linked in the description, and it shows a synopsis of the situation, explaining which parts of the trenches, and this is from satellite imagery, are under likely Ukrainian control or likely Russian control. So this was done by the Black Bird Group. This is a Western source, so obviously they do have an inclination towards the Ukrainian side, but either way, I think they do a very good job analyzing the situation and getting satellite imagery. And so here you can see the trenches that they've analyzed based on the footage that I was showing above to be most likely under Ukrainian control. So that includes the trenches over here and over here. But then the most complex part of the trench system, which is the westernmost parts of the trench system just to the south of Robotyne, is located over here. And that is still under Russian control based on this report over here. And this trench, if this is the case, is probably isolated from many of the main Russian groupings within Novodonetske itself. So if the Ukrainians continue sending small infantry groups towards these trenches over here, and albeit that will come at a cost to their infantrymen, and then begin to flank what's left of the Russian defenses in the most complex part of the trench system, they will eventually be forced to withdraw, and that would give Ukraine control over a hill, which could be used to overlook the surrounding valley and push into Novodonetske. But as I said before, Novodonetske is extremely fortified, has extreme density of Russian forces because of the 2 VDV units that were moved in to help reinforce the front line around Robotyne, the 7th and 76th VDV divisions, but not the entire divisions were moved in, just several regiments within them, which I have linked on my map. And speaking of the 76th VDV division, there are some reports from the Russian side claiming that there was a Russian counterattack within Robotyne, and this is coming from smaller Telegram channels, so I don't want to sort of characterize this as all Russian sources saying this. There were a few that were saying it, and there's also the Rybar map, which says that the southern outskirts are still under Russian control and that the center is a gray zone. And this is just not backed up by the footage that I've shown you guys today. Maybe something happened since then. Maybe something happened from a different vector, like maybe the Russians attacked from here and were able to re-enter Robotyne, but there's no proof to back that up just yet, so don't jump to conclusions. Now, also on the Robotyne sector, we have breaking news regarding the destruction of the first Challenger 2 British tank on the front lines. I think this is actually the first time it's been destroyed in combat. There was one time it was destroyed in Iraq, but that was from friendly fire. So this is the first time that it's ever been destroyed by an enemy belligerent, to my knowledge. And I'll just show the video to you guys. In the video, it's a Ukrainian soldier who's passing by the destroyed Challenger 2. You could see how the smoke is coming out from the hull and from the turret, and how it just looks like it suffered very extensive damage. The car also passes by some damaged T-64 actually, and 2 other destroyed fighting vehicles. And just to give you guys an idea, we don't know what specifically destroyed this tank. It could have been artillery. I think that's the most likely option. It could have been a combination of both artillery and a drone strike. It could have been a mine that it ran over. But to me, it seems like it was most likely an artillery strike. And as you can see from the smoke coming out from the tank itself, it looks like there was a cookout inside. So what I mean by that is that the Challenger 2 tank that was given to the 82nd Air Assault Brigade, because the 82nd Air Assault Brigade was given 14 Challenger 2 tanks, and that's the total amount that was given to Ukraine. Those Challenger 2 tanks, they were burning inside because of the cook-off of the ammo inside the tank. So the Challenger, it doesn't have blow-up panels, and blow-up panels are supposed to release the pressure and the gases that they would accumulate as a result of an internal explosion. And so these panels, they are meant to redirect the explosion away from the crew compartment in order to ensure that the tank doesn't get destroyed and that the crew itself doesn't die. But in this case, the Western news, they reported that the crew is actually able to survive. I don't know if that's for sure. Like, I don't know if we saw a video of the crew afterwards, but that's what they were saying. And regardless of whether the crew survived or not, which I think is important because these Challenger 2 tanks are replaceable. The British, they have over 200 of these, and I think they have 157 in operation that in theory could be sent to Ukraine sometime in the future. And again, Ukraine were given 14 Challenger 2 tanks, so they have 13 left. But the crew is extremely important because, you know, they get trained and those lives cannot be replaced as effectively as the armor can. But the reason why this is so important is because this is the first time that we've actually seen them engaging in such combat. And what this means is that the Ukrainians are committing a lot of the remaining Western equipment that was given to them and was slated to be used in the counteroffensive. It means they're using more of their forces from within the 82nd Air Assault Brigade and the 46th Air Assault Brigade. And it shows they're all in all trying to intensify the attempts at breaking through the Russian lines. And invariably, when you try to do that and you begin using more of your weaponry that you weren't using previously, that will lead to damage, such as the damage that is shown in this video. And just to show you guys an overhead view, you could see over here that the British Challenger tank was destroyed, and 2 destroyed Ukrainian BMPs and an M113A armored personnel carrier. They are also nearby. So this seems like an area where a lot of Ukrainian armor was destroyed. This might be some sort of road junction where you had battles between the Ukrainian armor and Russian artillery and drones and such. Now, looking at Verbove, in this area, the Ukrainians are continuing to send small infantry groups across the anti-tank ditch and towards Russia's manned defensive line, their trench that is just to the west of Verbove. We have 2 new videos showing how the Russians are responding to this threat by increasing artillery strikes, airstrikes, and also by dropping bomblets on from drones onto the advancing Ukrainians. So here's an example of that. Russia dropped 4 missiles on hedgerows near the anti-tank ditch. And this seems like a congregating point for the Ukrainians. This area over here where you have these 2 different tree lines that are running through. This may be a route that they are using to infiltrate past the anti-tank ditch and approach Verbove. And so it makes sense that the Russians would be hitting it. Then a bit to the south over here, you have a video of a Russian drone that drops bombs on a Ukrainian force, and this is a pretty sizable Ukrainian force. It wasn't just 1 or 2 men, there were multiple men in the video, and they were just walking through the anti-tank ditch. They were walking within it, and you could see that it's completely empty, which is par for the course. You wouldn't really expect Russian infantry to be there, as it's not a manned trench, but you have the Ukrainians that are trying to set up positions over there based on the drone footage, and then they were struck accordingly by the Russians. So here is that video, so you guys can get an idea of what I'm referring to with those two tree lines. This is one of the tree lines, and this is the other one. And you could see that the fields in between those two tree lines are being hit by the Russian Air Force, showing how they are increasing their air sorties in the region to hold back the Ukrainians as they try to advance. Now, I've seen some maps that are claiming that the Ukrainians do have a firm control past the anti-tank ditch. I think it's too premature to say that. And I think that a more accurate describing of the situation is that Ukraine has consolidated control of the fields that are basically in front of the anti-tank ditch, which would include the area over here, over here, over here. You're not really going to see many Russian forces in that region. This is now solidly Ukrainian territory. But I don't think it's fair to say that they have solid control over the fields over here that I'm marking with these lines yet, as they're still sending in small groups, and those small groups are forced to withdraw at a certain point, which shows it's not solid control. But I think that as they send more and more, they're getting more emboldened. They're sending larger squads now. Instead of 2, it's like 6 now in these videos that we're seeing as time goes on. And we're seeing how the fighting is gradually shifting eastwards in the direction of Verbove in order for the Ukrainians to sort of shape the battlefield in a way where they can later on create the conditions for a major infiltration of Russia's anti-tank ditch and the manned trench line. Now, while the Ukrainians have been making gains recently, as we've discussed throughout this video, this is certainly coming at a cost. And this is an article that was released by the Times, and I thought it was a pretty good article, which talked about the Skala battalion and the 47th Mechanized Brigade, which are units that are engaged in the counteroffensive around Robotyne. I won't go through the entire article, but I'm going to talk about the main points because I thought it was pretty interesting, and it gives us an idea of the Ukrainian perspective in this region. And so just starting off with the Skala battalion. The Skala battalion is an intelligence unit, and they also conduct special forces operations. And so they're not really equipped with armored personnel carriers or infantry fighting vehicles. So when the counteroffensive really started, we were expecting Leopards and Bradleys to be at the forefront of the vanguard, breaking through the Russian lines and advancing at rather quick pace to achieve gains before the Rasputitsa set in, and that would be throughout the summer. But due to the prepared Russian defenses and the lack of air support and the lack of proper mine-clearing equipment for the Ukrainians, they were unable to do this. And as a result, the Skala battalion, which is more so of a special forces unit with small infantry groups, they were really relied upon by the Ukrainians to conduct a lot of the dirty work in order to continue their advances. And that would be advances through minefields, that would be advances through all of these fortifications that you guys see on the map over here, that are marked in light green. And they would usually do this at night, and as a result, they would experience extremely heavy casualties. Just based on the article, and they interviewed troops that were actually from this battalion that talked about their situation, the Skala battalion has actually been reduced by 75% since the start of the counteroffensive due to the high amount of casualties that they've incurred due to these constant attacks, constant frontal assaults on the Russian positions, which have had a certain amount of success, especially around Robotyne, where there's so many defenses that aren't even marked on the map that had to be overrun. And a lot of that was done by Skala, especially just to the north of Robotyne. And a guy that was interviewed by the Times, he also said that 90% of the men that were really at the forefront of these operations, they were basically slated to die, unfortunately. And so originally, what was supposed to be an armored column advance, it turned into a small infantry advance that really grinded out for many, many months, with the battle lasting for about 3 months. The article also talked about the 47th Mechanized Brigade, which is one of these units that was receiving a lot of the Western weaponry. And so they were supposed to be at the forefront of the attacks, as I talked about before, trying to break through. But as we stated before, for all the aforementioned reasons, they were unable to do this at a quick pace, and thus suffered very, very, very heavy casualties. And based on the article, talking to people on the ground, the medics that were operating with the unit say that the casualties of the 47th Brigade actually reach into the thousands. And so think of it, a brigade that Ukraine has on paper should be around 4,000 to 5,000 men, but we know that a lot of these units are not at full strength. So maybe it's like 3,000, 2,000 men. And if that would be true, then 1,000 men being counted as casualties, not necessarily dead, but also like wounded to a point where you can't fight anymore, that would reduce the combat effectiveness of these units significantly. I can't say 50% because I don't know for sure, but it would be a very high number. And in fact, a lot of the medics that were interviewed, they were saying that their medic crews were reduced by 50% due to casualties. And that's in spite of the fact that they were using M113 armored personnel carriers that are supposed to be used by the medics to collect the wounded from the battlefield, to evacuate them to the makeshift hospitals that were set up on the front line. Now, in spite of all of this, the Ukrainians continue launching attacks, and now they're launching attacks on a new part of the front line that was previously untouched. And this is the area that is in between the Velika-Novosilka axis, which I'll mark over here, and the Vuhledar axis. So this span of land over here, which is about, 28 to 30 kilometers wide. This area is very lightly fortified. You can see the fortification map. There's not many Russian fortifications. There's not many Russian units in this area. There's not many towns in general. There's not many roads. A lot of this area is just generally open. It's a good area to utilize vehicles because the terrain isn't that rugged. And so you could theoretically advance using them. And that's apparently what happened over the past few days, as we have reports from the Russian side talking about attempted Ukrainian assaults on two villages, on the villages of Novodonetske and Novomayorske, and those came from the north in this direction. So the Russian sources report that the Ukrainians had artillery preparations for a few days and then went on the attack, but the Russian sources report that they were able to repel the initial assaults. I can't confirm that, and now there's just clashes going on in this region. I also wrote a tweet about this sector a few months back, which is pretty interesting, and I explained the situation around here, so you could read that tweet as well. And what you'll see here is that there's a 14.5 kilometer strip of land in length before you reach the actual defensive line of the Russians in this region. And so that could be potentially an area that Ukraine wants to attack now in order to sort of yield gains that they have tried to also do around the Verbove axis. So it could be trying to attack on a new vector for the counteroffensive, or it could be a way to divert Russian attention away from the situation around Verbove to instead send their reinforcements towards this area over here. Now, last thing is that we have a new video footage released by the Russians showing them hitting Ukrainian positions within the northern parts of Pavlivka that are to the north of the river over here, which divides Pavlivka. And so the area that Ukraine controls based off of this footage is the northern parts, which is the industrial area, has some warehouses and farmland. And I think this was previously marked under Ukrainian control on my map, so this is not anything new to my knowledge, unless there's additional information that I haven't mentioned yet. But the video just shows artillery strikes and drone strikes, so we have to wait before we could say anything conclusive about new Ukrainian advances in this region. But that's really it for today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.